Hi, good evening. I'll speak today about the silence of the inaudible. But first of all, I want to say thank you very much to Rafal Mazur and Lukasz Sochacki for inviting me to come and speak as this last lecture of this series. I feel very honored to be here with you this evening. Silence, the inaudible, quietness are very vague terms. They describe very complex material but also aesthetic and political phenomena that are entirely contingent in how they make meaning. Silence means so many different things for different people. They have different meanings and they have different connotations, dependent on its circumstance, dependent on who's the author of the silence, who is the listener of the silence, our positions and our positionalities. A week ago I was in Bern in Switzerland, where I run a collaborative art and architecture project with David Mollin and a yearly invited artist. There we work with 8 to 9-year-old pupils of a very multicultural community school to practice listening and sound making, so that they're in this new built primary school can find their own voice, can find their own way to sound and listen, so that they might develop a sonic sense of their educational environment and start to hear themselves in this very structured space that demands of them a lot of quietness, of listening, of shutting up, of not saying anything while somebody else speaks. As part of one of the listening exercises I did with them, I asked them to go out and find a silent sound in their school environment, to listen to this silent sound, to walk towards this silent sound, and then to try and imitate it and make it with their body, with their voice, their hands, their feet, anything they had available. However, what they did is they didn't go on to listen to this silent noise, but they went straight on to make this silent sound. So they started to make it, to author it. There was no gap between listening and making. It was one thing, the making of silent sounds. The pupils, maybe due to their age, they were only 8 and 9, or due to the environment where they have to always be quiet and listen, did not want to engage with the silence around them in a passive way, but wanted to author the silence and as a sound that involved their bodies, voice and hands straight away. That was extremely interesting to me. And when we discussed these made silences, I asked them what they thought a silent sound actually was. I asked them to describe it. And they used different adjectives, but essentially always just said the same thing: silent, quiet, not loud, unheard, inaudible. And we never came to what it actually is, apart from at that very moment when they made the silence. To me, both those instances, both those reactions or responses to my queries were very interesting. So on the one hand, that they wanted to make the silence rather than listen for it, and the fact that they struggled for words to describe it. Because it was about the agency. Who had agency over this silence? Who had agency over producing this silent sound that they had been invited in or demanded into every day? Schools demand silence of their pupils. They demand the listening to the teacher's voice. Therefore, to be able to make that silence rather than being terrorized by its demand seemed important to all of them. This experience made me think about this talk. It made me think about the plural meanings and experiences of silence and how it reveals and generates positionalities, meaning the privilege of being able to demand silence, or the necessity to obey silence, and the lack of privilege. In that sense, silence as a material and concept reveals and stresses the need to not simply talk about sound as something over there, as something we can talk about as a visual reference, or as a source, or as a material, musical or semantic, everyday or professionally, but about that when we talk about sound, we need to talk about the place from which we hear it and the place from which we make it, being an aesthetic place, but also a political place and a social place, our positionality. So we have to talk about authorship and ownership, and whose silence is heard and whose silence remains inaudible. The inaudibility of silence for me becomes very relevant. A heard inaudible gains a stage, starts to be heard. Its apparent absence becomes a presence. And of course here I think, for example, of the sort of seminal and always mentioned John Cage work on silence. That's not silent at all. It is an extremely loud silence that is framed by his authority, by his privilege, by his canonic position and positionality. But an unheard inaudible remains inaccessible and is simply absent. And so though silence we can think of, I just want to sort of go through a few ways in which I've been thinking through silence. As an artistic silence, say the silence of Cage, it has ambiguity. Is it there? Is it not there? Is it an unheard? How does it stretch my ears? What does it demand me to think about audibility? Because I know it is audible because his authorship makes it so. Or then that silence which is unambiguously just simply not there, just simply not heard. That is absolutely absent. It is denied a space that it can resonate in. The latter I find particularly interesting when it is not within art, but when it gets us to a physiological, we cannot hear it, like certain frequency ranges that we as human beings cannot hear, but also to a political and a social silence of things we simply don't want to hear or do not have the access to, do not understand that they hear to be heard, and that we don't have an interest or an investment in. So silence sounds the privilege that performs the power and entitlement to let others wait for its sound. If you have the time, you can speak really slowly, and you have to listen to me. So I could stand here and say nothing for quite a while, which I experience as quite a demand and a terror on people's time and expectations. Whereas if you know you only have 2 minutes, say, to speak in an office to make your case or in front of a judge, you have to speak very fast and loud and as quick as you can. So in silence and the inaudible, there is also an issue of justice and injustice. Who has the entitlement to speak and to be heard? This silence of power is also linked for me to the idea of taxonomies, of categories, of tidying up and of rationality. So that silencing of sounds, as a silencing of anything, is also what enables us to have categories, to have taxonomies, to have an organization of knowledge and ideas in the world. Because it means that everything that we consider not to fit in within the categories has to be silenced, has to be taken away, has to be hoovered out, has to be taken out, and is considered as noise that we silence in order to have our clear reference system, our clear ideas of what something is. I find that very important in relation to knowledge and epistemology and how we can know the world, and the way we certainly in Europe know the world, through categories, through a reference system, through historical and canonical lines. And lines always rely on the fact that everything that's beside the lines, the fuzzy bits, the other people that remain unmentioned, unheard, the other ideas and the other things that we don't want to deal with, are not considered, are silenced. In other words, silence, thinking through all these different suggestions I have just made, silence is polyphonous. It comes in many voices and with many ears and bodies, and we need to tend to it in different ways, and we also suffer it in different ways depending on our positionality. So silence can be messy, disorderly, plural, and demanding of plural engagements, and a sense of where we hear the silence from and where we do the silence. I'm sure in the course of these lectures, and I don't know whether any of you have sort of seen all of them, of the whole lecture series, or at least some of them, I'm sure you've explored many of the sort of issues and facets and possibilities of what I've just mentioned. Today I want to focus on a few aspects of this phenomenon, to listen a little closer to what they might be, and how we might be complicit also in the materialization of silence, in the aesthetic and also in the politics of silence. What is our place within that? How do we practice? How do we hear silence? So we come to hear not silence as an isolated phenomenon, but from our positionality and from our orientation, how we oriented in the world. The place from which we sound silence and the place from which we hear it. In other words, to hear the plurality of silence and what its logic is for our position. And that we also hear the missed connections, the ignored connections, and what it can make audible when we stretch our ears towards it. I would like to listen and read and bring into resonance and thus into space, into this space, some ideas on silence and its consequences. And finally, I want to turn to that suitcase that you see over here for a suggestion of how we could start to hear these silences with nuance and to start to make them audible. In that sense, I'm also talking about an expanded silence and an expanded listening that isn't only a listening of the ear, but a listening of the whole body. And I'm also talking about responsibility, written in one word, and responsibility. Dana Haraway's separation of response and ability, with which she brings together the responsibility as an ethics of listening to small, inaudible, barely audible sounds, and the responsibility, the ability to respond, and what we give their ability to respond to. In other words, to listen for a silence with all voices present and heard. The ethics of such an undertaking and the training needed is embodied by this suitcase. So I feel to actually get to this silence, to grasp its politics, and that it is not just a matter of art, it's not just a matter of aesthetics, but a political issue. I feel we need, or I certainly need, some sort of training, a different training that could start in the school with such school children that I've worked with in Bern. And the way I'm going about it is with this suitcase. I'm sort of traveling a little bit frustrated by the lack of sound studies and the learning and teaching of sound in school, because whatever we learn is in effect a visual studies. We just don't call it that way because it's so normative. It is so normal that everything we learn is visual. We not talk about it. It's just a neutral position. And the kind of frustration in that neither in kindergarten, in primary school, secondary school or university we really have a sonic competency that we're learning. And my inability to persuade various institutions and universities to do so. I got myself a suitcase and I've traveled to these various places. There's some other stickers on the back and I hope to travel to more of these places to kind of be a traveling saleswoman for a transversal sound studies, so that I can try to make advocacy and sell the idea of a transversal sound studies. That is a sound studies that practices a transcultural and transdisciplinary study from sound, not about sound, but from sound. And I hope to later at the end of the talk come back to this suitcase and practice, show you what this practice and this learning might entail, and what we kind of would need to learn to listen to silence. A suitcase is shaped by the context, of course, of art, Marcel Duchamp's Boîte en valise, but also more recently work like Shanice Garth, who has suitcases of her ancestors. She's a First Nation Indigenous person in Australia, and she has suitcases of her ancestors that she calls her royal family, that she carries along with her. So suitcases have also in more recent artwork a notion of a nomadicness, bringing to the front the idea of being a refugee, or also bringing a different heritage with you as you travel as an artist. So it has a contextualization in art as a performative and an iconic work, but it is also conceptualized in relation to travel. It is a privilege to travel and a possibility, but for others it also a threat of forced movement, of having to travel, of having to go somewhere, and also the inability to move when you wish to do so. So for me, the suitcase stands as a focus and tool, playful and serious at the same time, to collectively generate a new thinking and sensing from sound as a multisensory path towards an urgent, novel engagement with wider problems. So that through listening and through training in listening, we can, for example, in the context of this conversation, come to hear silence, polyphonic silences, different silences, and investigate and start to understand how we sit within them, how we're complicit, how we hear them, how we make them, in order to engage from that in social, political, global issues. So this suitcase is filled with things, suggestions and scores. These aim to enable a sonic doing as active sound making and listening, recording and narrating together. To experience the world as a relational sphere and a generative of another view, a view of ourselves as beings with. Because in sound we're always relationally together. We are together in this room, and my sound cannot be barriered off necessarily. It is porous, it is leaky, it goes to other places. And everything that is in this room swings together. So when I clap, in my clap you don't hear this hand and that hand, or that hand, and you don't even hear the in-between space, but you literally hear everything from the wooden floor to the fabric on the sofa, to the lights, the glass walls, everything vibrates and resonates within this clap. So when I listen to sound, I hear relationships. I don't hear this or that. I don't hear the suitcase or the computer, but I hear these relationships. And I think that is a very fruitful imagination to hear particularly silence, to hear silence as an access point for hearing relationships and asymmetries of these relationships. But before to get to this suitcase, I want to sort of make a detour a little bit into a sort of my other thinking about this polyphonous silence. I don't aim to make a comprehensive overview of everything that silence is, not at all. I think because whatever I do, whatever I say, of course I silence something else. Something else is said, is unsaid, remains inaudible and could be said. So any suggestion I make is just a suggestion within a polyphonous silence where so many other things could vibrate and resonate along and with. And to acknowledge the kind of contingency of this endeavor, that it is temporal, that it is always the relationship we have right now, I want to focus on the jointly experienced but also very differently lived through period of the context of COVID, the pandemic. Because the contagion of the virus and the pandemic forced us to isolate. So we had to separate physically. We had to bring our exchanges online, so people who listen online, they're still in that mode, and we've gained that. From that, we've gained the ability to listen to talks online and to find a togetherness on different online platforms. But we had to be online. It was forced upon us, so we had to be behind masks or behind windows, behind doors, behind walls. And it brought, in this sense, it brought silence into a new frame, that of care and carefulness, but also that of loneliness. In particular, in this context, I want to consider the silence generated and framed by online interfaces through which we came to meet. So if you are on Zoom or whatever the platform is that it is screened upon, that on these interfaces themselves there is a silencing taking place, a silencing through the technology that is taking place. There are different online platforms, Microsoft Teams, the big blue button, Zoom, whatever, Skype, whatever you experienced, they all have these aspects. They all have these aspects of filtering out and of silencing certain sounds. And that's what I briefly want to focus on. So for almost 3 years, we spent a lot of time in those digital boxes, some more, some less, of course, dependent on your work, on where your relatives live, where your loved ones live, etc., etc. And they framed our communication and our being together, but they also were a frame of machine learning. I don't want to call it artificial intelligence because I don't think it's particularly intelligent, but it is certainly artificial, but it does machine learning. Over this time, the software has learned from us how to silence our bodies, how to silence excess, breath, stutter, the way our clothes move, the way we mumble, the coughing, the rustling of cloths, and so on. anything that the machine learned to deem unnecessary and even undesirable, which is a very terrible term, it cut out, it got rid of. It got rid of everything that it considered noise to produce for us a clearer and more legible signal. And in this process of learning from us how to get rid of us, essentially, so that we wouldn't speak beyond the semantic, that another tongue is impossible, that we were silenced to get us to clarity, to make a pure signal. So without breath, without murmur, but also without accents. So I experienced a lot of the lockdown time in England, and even just a slightly more northern accent to the kind of your so-called neutral English. The machine had real difficulty. One couldn't hear everything, let alone if you were, if you had other speech impediments, a stutter, a murmur, if something didn't quite sound right. Your voice was simply cut out, you weren't there. And also, of course, there's this issue with English being the main language spoken on Zoom, so offering the most material for the machine to learn from, where other accents, other dialects, other languages were made entirely inaudible. We can argue how this is beneficial and how it makes communication apparently easier if you can hear exactly every vowel and every consonant I speak. However, what gets lost is all the sounds of our bodies, and how we need, and what we can become aware is how we need those sounds that have now been silenced to really truly understand each other and understand each other differently, more complexly. How we need to understand each other also through our bodies, through exactly our breath, and also in the inaudible, to be able to connect through our ambiguities and through what remains unsaid, and everything that's not only that's on that line, that straight, categorizable, referenceable line of legibility, but everything else that falls outside that line. That what is lost is the fuzzy, the monstrous, the leaky, the ambiguous body of our expressions. And I, for one, really love the fact that we can be in rooms together again. Don't know how long it will last. I'm sure the next pandemic or similar thing is just around the corner. But I think this is an important moment to understand all those small, inaudible sounds that we need to truly understand each other. Because they are vital for us to understand ourselves, not simply as speakers and recipients of speech, but as these beings with that live in this relational sphere that my clap made audible, in this vibrational resonance, where we are not just me and you, but where we are these interbeings, as interbeings and beings with everything, with human and more than human bodies. So that we actually exist not as semantic, categorizable bodies, or subjectivities, but in material entanglements, however invisible, however ambiguous. We live in the material entanglements of breath and stutters and hesitations and accents and murmurs and all the sounds from which we glean knowledge and the ideas of what is said beyond that which is semantically said. Where silence is relational, its task is not to communicate, but to create proximity, and the material, the cloth, to make us understand each other. It is in this proximity and the material of the in-between, the relational, and not on the straight horizontality of words, that we come to understand each other and what we mean to say. By contrast, the machine learning and the different platform treats us algorithmically. It reduces us to the signal, it suppresses the body and breath, suppresses ambiguity of our exchange, instead of opening us to a sensibility and the need for interpretation, of listening to the silences, to the inaudible, to that which our being with doesn't quite say, but their body might express and look for expression. Because some meanings then are simply not there. We are reduced and we are deducted. The aim for clarity and legibility means that the machine suppresses the noises of our bodies and that of more than human bodies. If you have ever experienced in Zoom, if there are noises around in the background, very often your vis-a-vis would actually not hear them. The machine has learned to filter them out. So also our context, the other human and more than human bodies around us have been filtered out. Thus we are silenced by what the machine has learned about our own voice, and we are silenced by our own drive towards legibility and efficiency. We lose the body into the silence of filtered reduction, rather than have silence support what we mean to say. Silence here refers to all the non-semantic material that machine learning considers unimportant. In this sense, silence stands for the noise in the system that gets filtered out. It stands as excess and as outside the necessary requirement for communication. In an essay I wrote shortly before for the pandemic, I discussed a book by Erin Manning and Brian Masumi that was called Thought in the Act. They wrote it in 2014. In the introduction to that book, they present us the idea of the outside of philosophy as a generative environment that offers itself to think collaboratively, to act of doing the impossible, whereby the impossible is not really what does not or cannot exist, but what we do not yet know, giving collaboration a generative and future capacity. So they celebrate in many ways the excess, the outside. Their close focus on work, on movements and expressions of the body and speech rather than language attaches a positive energy to this excess, to that which goes beyond and stands outside. Accordingly, language articulates not as a precarious bridge nor as an inevitable gap, but as a deliberate breach in what they call, and I quote, in the fragile difference between models of thought in the act. So it breaches the limits of language and it goes outside. Rereading their text now, post or between pandemics, and with the machine learning in mind that has reduced us to silent semantics bodies, it becomes clear to me that the notion of excess and the outside is a compromise. And it is a compromise that I'm not really willing to engage anymore post-pandemic. It identifies the affective and the refracted inarticulation, and they make an example of teenage speech, how teenage speech doesn't always find the semantic, but says, well, it's like that, a bit like the pupils in Bern who couldn't quite say what silence was, and that for them is the excess, that which doesn't quite fit into speech. And I feel that calling that the excess and the outside, a little bit like what machine learning does with removing our excess, is an appeasement of language. And it recreates disciplinary disciplines which guard speech and the line of speech and which guards the semantic from any critique. It ducks the confrontation with the body, with the murmur, with the stutter, with the silences and the silence. The excess and outside at once enables a different thinking, positioning the impossible, but it also legitimizes the silencing. It legitimizes it and it clarifies the boundaries, it shores up the boundaries and the lack of permeability, because it is a kind of filtering out. In their example, a filtering out of teenage speech, out of the so-called normal, legible, intelligible and legitimized language. And I'm interested in the excess inside language, so the silences inside language, and to leave them there. In the silence which remains inaudible but holds the potential for a different audibility. I'm interested in silences inside language and expression, also artistic expression, that does not overflow and sit outside, but forces the inside to acknowledge the body, to acknowledge the stutter, to acknowledge the physical, the leaky, the monstrous. The silence is not outside and in excess, but has a powerful way to resound what we hear, to resound language, to resound what we think is legible, to resound what we think is clear, legible. I want to bring the silence back in and in fact realize how language is generated by what was silenced rather than in semantic sense, so that we understand how important Those very bits that have been filtered out over the last 3 years are for us to be in communication, to be in conversation, to be in entanglement and entwined together. To this end, for this reason, I'm interested to flip listening from a focus on the semantic and the legible, what can be verified with a visual source and a clear correspondence, towards the fuzzy, the diffuse, the illegible, the excess inside. All those things with silence. And so I would like to change the algorithm. I would like the machines to learn from our murmurs, from our stutters, from our silences, from the hums and the ahs and the accents and the dialects that do not fit into the notion of legibility. To filter out and to learn over the next 3 years, say, to filter out the semantic, to filter out the hegemonic, normative, the dominant voice in favor of the noise of silence instead. I understand this as an act of resistance, a play and promise of alternatives, using the same mechanism against their own efficiencies. While there is playfulness in the idea, I'm also really serious about it. It's just I can't code algorithms, but if anybody can, I would very much like to have a Zoom equivalent that filters out the semantic. Because filters, or the reason I'm passionate about it is because filters are never neutral. The decision of what an undesirable is never neutral. It is always political. It is always ideological. It is representative of a bias, however unconscious and culturally embedded. The filtering of humming and breathing and being as being with is a broader socio-political filtering that expresses ideologies and fosters normativities and investments. This is where the silences of filtered bodies online meet the political, and in particular where they meet somebody, for example, like Nikita Dhawan's notion of strategic deafness. There may be unconscious, but certainly deliberate desire not to hear certain things. And an algorithm, a programming, can make this maybe personal, maybe cultural desire into a mechanism that normativizes it and obviously also speeds it up. And this desire not to hear certain things demonstrates the desire not to hear certain political realities and subjectivities that are, to the person filtering them out, undesirable, unthinkable, and a threat to the status quo or a threat to the values that they're pursuing. Thus it is a play with and makes us appreciative what political scientist Dhawan calls the privileged role of hearing and what is being heard. And I quote her from her text Hegemonic Listening and Subversive Silences, Ethical Political Imperatives, where she says, hegemonic norms of recognition determine what can be read, heard, and understood as intelligible and legible. And thus they determine, end of quote, what can make itself count and what by contrast remains silenced or spoken for. Listening out for a recognizable language only silences what speaks in another register. For Dhawan, it is the voice of the subaltern femininity that is caught in the crossfire of post-colonial language, and that does not hear her life and reality and does not listen for her articulation. And to her, the moment of resistance, which for me is to design a counter algorithm, for her it is a more subtle audition, a more subtle, a more nuanced hearing, listening that she would like to listen out for the non-linguistic. She suggests a practice of being in sound rather than its linguistic structure and rational infrastructure, to hear the silence speak in her own voice. So not to try and figure out where does the silence meet my language, where can I get snippets, and then ventriloquize those snippets, represent them, but where can I stretch my ear and stretch my body into a subtle audition, so I can hear them on their own terms, whatever the them is, whatever the unheard, the silenced is. So the practice of being in sound rather than its linguistic structure and rational infrastructure. And she also announces a language as another way of resistance, a language silence as a strategy for being overheard. So to not make yourself audible anymore in language, or particularly maybe in the dominant language, but to find another way of expression so that the ear of your listener has to change and the audition has to become subtler. So for her, a strategy is the refusal to be represented in language, in semantic and referential representation, by staying silent, by refusing to enter discourse. I quote her again. This approach shifts focus from the traditional logocentric strategies of resistance to possibilities of subversion through listening that transforms the power dynamics between active speaker, passive listener, and it is a crucial aspect of post-colonial feminist politics of recovering marginalized perspectives. End of quote. And I feel this shift and this counter-suggestion and this subversion is in many ways what I'd like for the algorithms of Zoom, if we could reprogram them, if we could program them the other way around, as a means of subversion, as a means of not being heard in language, but being heard exactly through the body, through the breath, through their very monstrous, very not categorizable and taxonomical, but very entirely relational and bodies with. So in our case, I suggest it's the refusal to being filtered into a pure signal, a semantic body, by tending to what is filtered out, what is silenced, that formulates a practice as an active silence, as a silence that speaks its own noise. And if you are on Zoom, you have certain options. You can switch certain filters off. So you can quite deliberately play with that a little bit, at least. And so inspired by Dawan, I propose to turn the amplification and intensification of the silencing online produced by machine learning during the pandemic on its head, to turn it around, to resist the silencing of the body by using the same digital infrastructure to erase the fictional clarity of the semantic voice in favor of a messy, monstrous body that can resist colonization by sounding polyphonous silences, to use the algorithm to filter the semantic and end up with the silence of noise. So Dawan, discussing Gayatri Spivak, discusses this as a counter-discourse, as a counter-position, as a counter-motion, and celebrates the making of audible of the noise. This is crucial because semantic legibility and preference is not a norm, but a cultural and political investment. It is hegemonic and violent organization that denies the response ability I mentioned earlier, Haraway's idea of all, the ethics of all voices audible. There are other legibilities that are silenced if we cancel silence as noise. And as the voice becomes ever clearer semantically, we become ever less able to hear the body and need to silence it further because we untrain ourselves to listen to the complexity of a body speaking. Every accent, every voice that stands outside the normative registered is filtered. And we enter into a vicious circle of enculturation, into a completely platonic world of silenced bodies. So in this sense, the silencing of what is judged as noise by a naturalized hegemonic ear is supercharged in the pandemic through the machine learning and the capabilities of online platform. And this, by extension and thinking, also supercharges the colonial oppression through a silencing of everything we do not know. We do not know how to hear, everything that demands a more subtle audition. It is a colonization and of the digital territory, importing and using the same asymmetries and unthinking, fully intentional discrimination in the desire of the online world and online communication. When we could use the sensibility of our contagion, because what happened during COVID, we became very aware that we are entirely interbeings, that we are extremely relational and codependent. Because if we were not open, codependent subjects, we wouldn't have had to wear masks. We wouldn't have had to stay at home. If we wouldn't be leaky and contagious, then that all would not have been necessary. So on the one hand, the pandemic made it very clear that your breath and my breath, they can make us ill, that viruses are everywhere, and that we breathe the same air. All over the world, we breathe the same air, and we really are in an ecosystem that we are entirely interdependent amongst each other, something we often want to deny when it comes to the climate emergency or to other global issues. There is a desire for a shutting of borders. If you, for example, look at Brexit as a very good example of an idea of partitioning, auto-partitioning, shutting off border to solve problems, when the problems we have or the issues we have are probably better solved in this shared air. So the pandemic has shown us, I think, and has really made it sensible to most of us that we are codependent and that we have a responsibility and a relationality. But the digital infrastructure that we've used to cope with it pretends we are entirely separate and that the semantic can be completely distilled away from the body into a complete and hyper legibility. And I want to go back to this sensibility and what we've experienced in the pandemic, this fragility, this vulnerability as open, leaky, permeable and porous bodies that couldn't be even in contact with other bodies. We had to really rethink whether we stop at the skin, and we clearly don't. This is a very porous and permeable surface. That's why I had to wash my hands all the time. That's why we had to wear masks all the time. And to bring that sensibility back into the online communication, to understand our codependency, our interdependency, our relationality, and that we bring through, which is to me also a sonic concept, because as the breath, sound also doesn't stop. Like my clapping showed, it relates to everything in this room. It goes beyond this room. The people that were just passing, their sound didn't stop outside in the hallway. It sounded in here. On Zoom, you can probably not hear that because the Zoom would have filtered it out as noise. But we heard it inside here. So sonically, these rooms are porous as much as our bodies are porous. And so this, for me, the sensibility gained in the pandemic holds something very important of how we want to be beings with, or could be beings with in the world that needs our understanding of a shared ecology. And sound, I feel, can help us carry that on, carry this sensibility on. So the resistance through listening and the resistance to this cleaning up effort of Zoom and other platforms through listening and to including silence within language, and by reverse charging the noise cancellation through an algorithm that learns from the silenced, can yield important insights and understanding from the body as a relational body with human and modern human beings, rather than at a distance and objectively heard and individuated. Listening to this silence, I think, brings us a certain skill and competency that I think is worthwhile acquiring and finally applying in a contemporary world where we need this understanding of relationality and responsibility, so that we can learn from the silencing of the noise and listen out for the inaudible to get an embodied, complex, tacit and also feminist as well as decolonial understanding of the heard that includes everything we cannot yet hear, but that our ear could strain towards, where we could develop this subtle audition. To achieve this competency and to hear the silence through its resistance and polyphonic possibility, that's where I'm advocating with my suitcase to transversal sound studies, as a study and methodology that traverses disciplinary lines to get to know the silence within every discipline. So that silence is not just an issue for music or for sound studies, but actually in every discipline, because sound is an issue within every discipline. So I advocate for such a transversal sound studies to be introduced in all teaching, learning and research institutions, from kindergarten right away up to university and even lifelong adult education. And that's what my suitcase is trying to do, and that is why I'm traveling around with my suitcase. Because the suitcase contains things that help me introduce and practice this transversal sound studies as a practical mode of theorizing with ears and voice and hands across disciplines and cultures. The aim is to produce generative plural knowledges not from outside the disciplines, so not from the excess, but from an embedded listening. So to achieve a kind of hybrid undisciplinarity. So we listen in and with every subject and unperform its borders and the violence of singular hegemonic knowledge paths, so that whether you're a geographer, art teacher, a language teacher in primary school, whatever you do, whatever field you're working in, or a historical researcher, that listening can play a part in how we think those subjects we're working with every day. So that we could all listen, a little bit like what I try to do with the kids in Bern, because they do very little non-semantic listening all day long. But to just try that out, try out what that would be, so it can then be carried into every lesson. So it's an embedded listening for the silence, an embedded listening for everything we normally, in the service of knowledge, cut out. Because what we cut out in the service of knowledge reduces knowledge as much as it apparently creates more clarity. So that we hear its silences and filters and can start to counteract them, start to bring other modes of working and other collaborative modes of working into every discipline. So in relation to the particular context and aim of these lectures, I would like to share what would be in the suitcase at this moment if we had the time to kind of workshop something together and do something together. So the aim is to practice a sonic sensibility, which I suggest may get us to this silence together. So, in the suitcase, I have all sorts of things. I have these things that you can put over microphones to hear what happens if I do a recording in the wind with or without this. What are the noises, because this is a filter as well, of course. And what happens if I don't put that on and go out on a windy day and I make a recording? What will that recording be like? And most of the time, field recorders would discard it, saying that's just noise. But what if we listen to it? And what if we listen to what is underneath and on top of that noise? What else we can hear? I also have various gloves to go around and knock on surfaces and touch surfaces in whatever building you work in or whatever materials you work in, to hear them differently, to hear them through their relationality. I have a stethoscope for closer listening, to create some proximity, and also some rubber gloves and some masks to try and hear each other through this filter, where we create a non-legibility. This is, I suppose, my analog version of an algorithm that would do the opposite of the machine learning cleaning up, but to try and get to as much noise as possible. So I have various things in here. I also have some stickers, of which you can take one if you like, to advocate for my transversal sound studies. And what I've done for today is I've written 3 scores that you can just do at any time, that I hoped would get us as possible exercises to get us to silence. Sound it. 6. Listen to an object you think is still. Listen until you can hear it move. Oops, you didn't see that. Sound it. 3. Listen to a sound you are not sure you can hear. Walk towards it. When you are sure you can hear it, hum it. Hum score. Stand in front of a window. Look out. What can you see? Bring your mouth close up to the pane. Hum open-mouthed. Let the window steam up until you cannot see it anymore. I guess that is a form of applying a visual filter to see less in order to see more. That was Siavash Amini's, an Iranian artist's interpretation of that score on the record I did with 8 different artists during the pandemic, where we were all obviously in isolation all over the world, and I sent them scores and they kindly wrote a piece for it, and that was his interpretation of unheard sound. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question. I have a question. Anna H. Anna H. Nancy Tuana wrote a text about the epistemology of ignorance, and she mainly meant academic and common knowledge. I wonder if silencing is exactly that, producing ignorance, and how would it be different from producing ignorance through selective writing or teaching at schools?
I have to confess, I find the question very difficult because I haven't read that text by Nancy Tauna, so I don't know exactly what she means by ignorance, because I find ignorance quite a negative word, and so I wouldn't say that. So I'm not sure whether the questioner, and if the questioner is still online, they can obviously send the backup, a secondary question, whether they mean that silencing produces ignorance, or whether they mean that focusing on silence produces ignorance, as in either the negative or a positive of a different knowledge. So I would love the person who asked this question maybe to specify a little bit what is meant, because I feel a bit ill-equipped to answer the question. Because to me, it's not silencing, or the focus on silence is not about being, or the filtering out the semantic and the conventionally meaningful of communication. So the semantic, the legible, is not to become ignorant, but it's to come to understand that the semantic on its own doesn't mean very much, that actually is an ignorance, because it needs to be embedded and embodied in the silence and in the entangled material of silence to communicate at all. It's like we're taking away the glue, we're taking away the relationality. But yes, if they could specify a little, clarify a little, then maybe I can answer it better.
So maybe we can wait a little, maybe
yes.
The author of the... Oh, okay. This is another part of question. Silencing produces ignorance, taking voice away. Nancy Tuana finds ignorance negative.
Well, I mean, if that's what this person says, who I haven't read, then I just disagree with them. It's not, silencing does not produce ignorance, I mean, to my mind. And again, there's a caveat. I hope I understand the questioner properly. It's not about, I mean, silencing produces ignorance. I mean, sorry, I just do not quite get what they're asking. But yes, I would say silencing produces ignorance because we're not looking at the complexity of something, which is teasing out the bare bones of communication, without the body, without the flesh, without the monstrous, leaky, breathing, murmuring, a body that's communicating it, that we all have to take into account when we come to at least a temporary understanding what somebody is or something means. And so I think, yes, sorry, I'm really bad with this questioner, but if they mean that silencing produces ignorance, then I agree. If they mean the opposite, then I disagree, obviously. Is that what they say? Do they say silencing produces ignorance?
Taking voice away.
But which voice? The semantic voice or the material voice?
I think that's semantic, yeah. There's no here, but I think it's...
I will look up this author, and I will have a look what she means, because I do not think that taking the semantic voice produces ignorance at all. I mean,
probably we have to read the text of Nancy Tuana
to really understand what is meant here. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
If you have any more questions, please, this is the time for, or any comments or something like this.
I just wanted to say that I was very moved by...
Tomek. Please.
I just wanted to say that I was very moved by this picture. One phrase that was present in your speech about the sound of clapping, and that it somehow connects everything. It's just my personal remark that I felt it very moving. I thought that it somehow connects with my strange feeling when I look at the gramophone, that you have just one groove and one needle, and all the instruments in music, all the sounds are in this one groove. So like unity. Everything is together, but in just one spot. Yeah. So, like a slightly different way of. So when you have just one moment of clapping that unites everything, it just connected in my mind with gramophone.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I think it's maybe that is one of the reasons I like to really play. Because obviously I have the MP3 files, but I like to have it on the gramophone, because it, as you say, it is one line, but it's not a straight line, and it's not a canonical line that goes from one end to the other, but it's a line that enables resonance, all sorts of resonance to gather up and go on and on and on and on and on. And that's why I switched it on in the beginning, even without any sound, because the whole idea was there is this silence. I silence the record and then I switch it on, but it's there. And if you go near enough, you can even hear the needle and the crackle, which you can't hear on an MP3, and you can't hear on a, you hear in a subtle audition, you can hear the possibility of that silence, which is all the sounds that gather within that groove. Yeah.
I have a, I think, comment, maybe a question. I'd like to check these philosophical and art ideas in, I would call it ethnographic field or vernacular group of people. How these ideas work in everyday life. Yeah? It's interests me as an ethnologist, so I find it as a fresh idea. Yeah. For me, what you said today, and maybe related with questions from the internet. My question: what do you think? Could silence produce power, agency? Power and agency. Positive subjectivity. Because silence commonly is related with the lower side of hierarchy. Yeah? Someone he's mute or is in silencing is a person without power and agency, commonly. Yeah, even not human. Yeah, in Polish language we said that fishes and children don't have a voice. Yeah? So animals and children are on the ground floor. For example, Stephen Feld said that in Kaluli stones have a voice.
Yeah.
So, so the ontology, this is an interesting ontological shift connected with silence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great fan of Stephen Feld, and I really like his notion of acoustemology, so this idea that the simultaneity of everything that sounds, that is also quite hierarchyless, that when you're in the, so he talks about the Kaluli forest, so this very dense tropical forest where, of course, your visual perception or your visual norms don't get you very far, because you can only see to the next tree. So you need to find the different ways to orientate and find a sense of the place you're in. So he talks about acoustemology, about a knowledge that comes from sound, and then that sonic knowledge has not to do with I hear this, I hear this, I hear that, but exactly that relationality in the rainforest, where the sound is so dense and everything sounds together, and you can't just say, oh, you are quiet and I can hear you. So the sound and the stone has a sound. And I think something like that, even just talking, you say, how can it work? I think the reason I am so keen on my suitcase of transversal sound studies, because I really think every teaching, learning, social institution needs a sound studies officer. You know, somebody who is in there, who can communicate and advocate for thinking through the sonic in every discipline, whatever it might be, or in every learning environment, in every being together environment. So that's kind of the vernacular, the doing it on a daily basis. And obviously also, if school children were trained like that in kindergarten, they would be very different adults, and they would have a very different ear, and they would have a different sense of their own position within that sphere. So we could all start to appreciate the density of the rainforest within Krakow or within Berlin or wherever it is we're living, that we start to hear the silences as audible sounds and make them responsible. So have their voice audible when everything else is audible. And that's why it's so important, because it's not just a means to train your ear. It is a means to untrain hierarchies, political expectations, social expectations, and how we can think about the world and how the world's organized. The way the world's designed is obviously human-made, and it could be a different world. It could be a completely different world. We could have designed it, worked on it, built our cities in various different ways, but we have one very particular spatial imaginary in the West, a kind of Cartesian spatial imaginary of where we can measure things, we know where things are, and things are separate from each other, and that's why we can say, oh yeah, this is 5 meters over there, 2 meters over there, rather than we could think it the completely different way around. They are connected by this. So we could have, like in front of our eye, instead of the photograph, we have the negative, and we look at the in-between and the relational spaces, like what we hear in the clap, that we see that. So for me, it's not, and I hope I make not too big a detour, it's not about listening, it's about seeing more, seeing differently, about the multi-sensory perception that can grasp the world through its relationalities and it in between and almost in the negative. And I know that sounds a bit sort of science fiction, like our whole way we see the world is different, but I do think it's possible, and it is beneficial, because we could, it's not about erasing, and that's why it's not about ignorance. It's not about erasing the semantic, but it's about understanding the silence within the semantic. Understanding the monstrous, the leaky, the porous, the bodily, the fleshly within the semantic, that makes the semantic speak. And there is an illusion that the semantic can exist separately from that we can, through an algorithm, make it onto this skinny line of really only words. And obviously, I think if we would make this algorithm ever stronger, we could really not understand it anymore at all. If we would say, well, what are the bare bones of communication? What do we actually need? So it's not about getting rid of the semantic and becoming ignorant, if that is indeed what, I've got her name already, suggests in her text. It is about understanding the relationality of language, where the semantic sits together and is embedded with the bodily, the physical, the silenced, and even noise. Extreme noise is in there too, because they're not a binary, they are on the same spectrum of fuzzy material. And so I think I hope it would lead to an augmentation of human sensibility. You know, we would see and hear and smell and feel more, not less. And therefore, the problems we need to tackle at the moment are so complex. Climate change, public health, pandemics, social injustice, war, etc. And they are all, like the pandemic showed, interdependent problems. So climate change creates the scarcity of resources, which creates migratory pressures, which create war, and which create pulmonary diseases, because of people living on closer distance. So the pandemic is one of the consequences of climate change, even if that's on the way we treat animals, what we eat, how we travel, our culture. And so we need the sensibilities and the thinking ability to see those problems together, not in separate, oh, there's a climate scientist, here is a public health scientist, here is this, here is that. We need, absolutely desperately need a hybridity or a means to understand the relationality of the problems. And I think the pandemic has made it clear there is a relationality, and I think sound can help us on a daily basis on every level and in every age to practice and grasp and access this relationality so that we can then unfurl ourselves and get away from this idea of the separable, which is a very visual phenomenon, a very visual sensibility that we can separate things out, that we have since Enlightenment, where we think, we need to measure things, we need to be clear about things, and that also is representative of a capitalist visuality. I mean, we could see differently. I'm talking about the cultural visuality that is we are trained in, and our eyes could see the world differently if we, maybe through the years or with the years at least. I hope that kind of made sense.
I'd like to have just a little comment. For me, quite striking idea was this dialectics between sound and silence. If I understood you correctly, of course, because I haven't been from the very beginning of your presentation, and it's just this idea that if there was no silence, there would be no sound. We couldn't perceive sound. I mean, correct me please if I understood it wrong, but I think it's quite anthropological also. These two opposite elements in world, that like negative and positive element in creating world, like in this folk cosmology. If there is no negative element, there would be no world. It's not something negative. It's just something that must be in world, and it just reminds me that this thing. And also, just to add to what Łukasz said, this empowering that the silence is empowering. Also in Polish language, in word German means Niemiec, and it comes from mute, like we perceive them like as mute people, so they were non-human. Just that remind me this thing also. And again, if I understood you wrongly, just please correct me. Thank you.
I find it interesting because I don't think that, to me, the silence is dialectical in that sense of an opposition, because if it was dialectical, there is always this sublimation. We can get rid of it again. They're binary, silence and noise. I more understand them as on a spectrum of all sounds, and they have their particularities, but then a really noisy sound in a noise concert can become totally silent because of the intensity, and that you can't even hear it anymore with your ears, but you hear it with your body. So I don't understand, but where I agree, or where I think, yes, they have to be there, this whole thickness of sound has to be there for there to be language, for there to be what we call the semantic noise. But the semantic noise, like the canonical line, it's not that they are special. They are within noise and silence. But we have, for various reasons, defined them as particular. And my interest lies in understanding where they're actually just as fuzzy as the rest, and just as illegible as the rest, and where they belong into the rest, and where, if we don't listen out just for this line of legibility or the line of the canonical historical, but we hear the volume of everything vibrating together, we can also rearrange our emphasis and what is important and what is not. And to me, that is decoloniality, and that's why decoloniality is important, not just in relation to political colonialism or imperialism, but in relation to our own idea of knowledge. I mean, we all have gone through a school system that has told us that this is important and this is not important, that has told us what we need to learn and how we are to learn and what knowledge is. So in many ways, I think it is up to each one of us to sort of auto-decolonialize ourselves. And the first step is just the awareness that the knowledge I have and I've been given in school and through my cultural upbringing is not the only knowledge there is. It is one of many different possible knowledges. And in the West, we call that the knowledge. You know, there's a universalizing principle of that this is a scientism, that this is what we need to know, or this is real, this is what makes sense. And I feel strongly that depending how close you are to the center, the less sense it makes. You know, the less that knowledge is my knowledge. And there are many knowledges I feel. So that's why I think to understand them all together in this voluminous dimensionality rather than opposite to each other, so we can't just sublimate them with each other, that's to me quite important.
Thank you very much. Maria, okay.
So I was curious about, I understood from your presentation that silence carries a lot of information. And usually it's information about what is left out, what we're ignoring, or what certain power structures are leaving behind. And I was curious if silence can also be like a mark of inclusiveness, or like if it can in some way sharpen our perception to see something that we didn't see before. So sort of like the other way around, not what is left outside, but what is inside, but maybe we didn't hear or see before.
Yeah, completely. I think inclusion is a good term, that it is, silence is inclusive in our expressions, but it is our task to hear it. You know, sort of to have this subtle audition that Nikita Dhawan talks about, that we can hear it within, not as an excess, not as, oh, these marginal voices that I don't hear or don't want to hear, but that actually they have an effect of what is within. And actually the idea that there's an outside and an inside is an impossible thing. Anything that we consider to be outside has an effect on what we even consider inside. So why don't we just consider everything inside, and there is only one inside, and we deal with the internal relationalities. And that means, yes, listening for the idiosyncrasies and the noises and the silences that are there. And that to me also means, of course, that I have to be silent. Sometimes, you know, as a kind of white European academic, you know, with a certain privilege. I'm not entirely in the center, but I'm not, you know, there are sort of nuances of where you are, and that also means sometimes to be silent for me.
So thank you very much.
Thank
Professor
you.
Voegelin was a guest of our seminar Silence, Meanings and Context. It was the last lecture. To było ostatnie spotkanie w ramach seminarium Cisza, Znaczenia i konteksty. Dziękujemy bardzo i zapraszamy w przyszłym roku. Proszę szukać informacji na naszych profilach na Facebooku. Thank you very much.
Thank you.